Today we're going to talk about the difference between global and local variables in Miva Merchant. There are two types of variables you can use in Miva's template language, a global variable and a local variable. Now, we're going to use our MBT assign tags that we learned in the last video to create some variables. It's really easy to tell the difference between a global variable and a local variable. A global variable will always be prefixed with g dot and then whatever the name of the variable is. So here I have a variable called g dot name with a value, which is a string because it's in single quotes, of Brennan. Now, if I want to output that value to the page, you're always going to reference it using this global keyword. So it's an MBT colon global, which means I'm referencing a global variable, and then the name of the variable that I picked, followed by a semicolon. This will output the value, whatever saved in here, so it's Brennan, you'll output that to the page. Now let's say you wanted to use your variable in a conditional statement, like an if-else statement. To do that, you always use the g dot and then whatever the variable name is. You wouldn't use the ANABT global name here. This only outputs the variable to the screen. You can't do any conditional statements against it. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So here's an example of an if statement in Miva Merchant. Now we're going to dive into this in more detail in one of the later videos. But for now, let's take a look at the expression here. We're saying if g.name is equal to the string value of Brennan, and because it is assigned its string value to Brennan here, we should expect this to output the value is Brennan. Global variables are exactly as they sound. They're global in scope. They're available anywhere on the page. If you define a global variable at the top of the page, you can use it, you can reference it, you can change it anywhere else on the page. Now let's take a look at local variables. So here we have the same MBT assign tag, so we're creating a variable, and the variable name is l.name, so L stands for local. The variable name is name, and the value again is Brennan. So now I have a variable called g.name and l.name, and these are two completely different variables, completely different in scope. Looking at the convention of global, you'd expect a local value to be displayed here, but that's not how Miva works. Instead, for any local variables, you simply put ANABT colon and then the variable name. However, this will not output any value to the screen. And this is really the big difference between local variables and global variables when working with the Miva template language. A global variable is available anywhere and can be output anywhere on the page. However, a local variable cannot be output anywhere on the page. Local variables can only be used in conditional statements, like if l.name equals Brennan, like we did here above. This would output correctly. Local variables are also local in scope from where they were defined. For example, say you defined a local variable within a for each loop or a while loop. That variable will only be accessible within that loop, whereas if you create a global variable within that loop, it would be available within that loop, but also anywhere else outside on the same page. A common question we see is, how do I know if a variable I'm working with is global or local? And it's really easy to tell. A global variable is always prefixed with g dot, and a local variable is always prefixed with l dot. Or, if you're looking at the output, a global variable will always have this global keyword when it's being output to the page. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in this video is the l dot settings structure, and we're going to dive into this a lot more in depth in the next video. However, I want to introduce it to you here. So, a few seconds ago, I said local variables cannot be output to the page. Well, that's actually not true. There's a special local variable called l.settings, which acts very similar to a global variable, where it's global in scope for that page, but it's still a local variable. And Miva uses l.settings quite a bit throughout all its page templates. And you'll see it referenced everywhere in Miva's template language. l.settings colon something, l.settings. It's very common, and you'll work with it quite a bit. So think of l.settings as a special local variable where you can assign different values into this l.settings, and it will act similar to a global variable where you can output anything to the page. So here's a quick example. So I have l.settings and then colon name. So this whole thing is a variable that I'm creating, and then I'm giving it the value of l.name, which is what we assigned up here, which should contain the value of Brennan. And so here, in this case, I can use ANABT colon name and to output this to the page. So while this may be confusing at first, LDOT settings will become second nature to you because it's used so much throughout the Miva Merchant template language. One other thing to note when working with global and local variables with Miva Merchant is Miva Merchant is not a strongly typed language. This means you don't have to declare a variable as an int or a string or a float. You just declare the variable and it can take on any of those values. Let's look at a few examples. So here I'm going to create a new variable using metAssign, and you'll notice I have some snippets that I'm using for Sublime Text that make this much easier. These are available to download as part of this training series. I'm going to create a variable called g.test, and here I could give it a value of a string, of another variable, of an expression of two variables added together, of a number. I can do almost anything I want without having to declare ahead of time that this variable is a string or is a number. So I can do this where the value is 5 and g.test would output 5. I can do an expression where you add two numbers together, so 5 plus 5, so this would evaluate to 10. Or I can do a string. And strings are always wrapped in single quotes. Or I can give it a value of another variable.